the world of Dark Souls is in a state of decay. Roaming through the narrow streets of the Undead Burg, and even beyond the Great Walls, through Anorlando, the grand city of the gods, we are continually followed by a feeling of longing, a constant reminder of a civilization that once lived, thrived, and has now seemingly vanished. In the short glimpse we get of the peak of Gwyn's Age of Fire, we see a familiar image, a prosperous society, with its rulers at its peak, and its people protected from the outside by a large wall. There was a predictable hierarchy, there was order, stability. But now, we see the rulers of Lordran shut off from its people, higher up and more distant than ever. And the people not protected from any outside forces, but seemingly from each other, as we see various walls neurotically placed all throughout Lordran, enclosing smaller and smaller portions of humanity. But let's go back even before the Age of Fire. In the Age of Ancients, the world is described as being unformed, shrouded by fog, and inhabited by everlasting dragons. From the perspective of the psychoanalyst Carl Jung, we could see this image as a sort of psychic womb, a time before time itself, an age with no history, before consciousness. It is, therefore, a complete state of unconsciousness, and it is inhabited by so-called everlasting dragons, who appear to simply exist in the purest sense of the word. They simply are, no different from the arch trees that surround them. Yet they are living. They are much like the Ouroboros, the image of the snake eating its own tail, the ultimate primordial symbol. Jung said this about the symbol of the Ouroboros: he slays himself and brings himself to life, fertilizes himself and gives birth to himself. He symbolizes the One, who proceeds from the clash of opposites, and he, therefore, constitutes the secret of the prima materia, the prima materia being, in alchemy, the primitive formless base of all matter, which, unquestionably, stems from man's unconscious. The everlasting dragons are timeless and unchanging. They represent the base state of all things, before the birth of consciousness, before the ego, before fire. And as the narrator says, with fire came disparity, differentiation. As Jung said, the clash of opposites, heat and cold, life and death, and of course, light and dark. This is the birth of consciousness. As Jung tells us, there is no consciousness without discrimination of opposites. The conscious ego can only recognize itself in contrast to other things, and from this point emerges time, history, culture, and archetypes and narratives. Gwyn embodies consciousness most clearly. He is order, hierarchy, structure. He's fire, light. But all lights cast a shadow. As Jung tells us, there is no light without shadow, and no psychic wholeness without imperfection. Humanity comes from the dark, and is in possession of the dark soul, that which the ego, which Gwyn, fears the most. Gwyn is hyper-obsessed with light, with consciousness, with control, and as Jung tells us, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. As the Age of Fire comes to an end, Gwyn links the flame, in order to prolong his Age of Fire. He represses the shadow, and as we come into the world of Dark Souls, the fire is fading again. It no longer stands on its own and requires human sacrifice. The philosopher/historian Oswald Spengler describes civilization, society, and culture as living organisms, which makes some sense intuitively. They are, after all, composed of people, and like people, like living beings, they follow a natural rhythm, a cycle, you could say. Life itself, in its most fundamental forms, consists of a birth, a flourishing of life, and an eventual death, a cycle that gives life its meaning and structure. Spengler argues that civilizations mirror this same cyclical pattern. They rise, they evolve and flourish, and inevitably, like all living things, die, giving the opportunity for something new, something possibly greater to arise. Yet Gwyn denies death. As a manifestation of the ego and of consciousness, he demands control, and what is a greater loss of control than death itself? By attempting to prolong his Age of Fire and repress the natural decay of both life and culture, Gwyn denies life's natural cycle, which then causes the undead curse. And what is this undead curse if not a manifestation of Gwyn's refusal of death, his refusal to let the Age of Fire die as it was meant to? Now, it's very easy to judge Gwyn, but his linking of the fire, his fear of change, his denial of death, is painfully human, and perhaps that is the problem. It was the action of a man, and not of a god. As Aldea, the scholar of this first sin, says,
"Life is brilliant, beautiful. It enchants us to the point of obsession."
I believe it would be an interesting thought experiment to compare this state of affairs in Lordran to the philosophical condition, let's call it, that Europe found itself in the late 19th century. Friedrich Nietzsche was writing in a similarly scary and perilous time, at a time when the foundational structures that had given Western culture its meaning were beginning to collapse, where Nietzsche saw a metaphysical death, the death of God, just like the citizens of Lordran witnessed the fading of the flame. With the advent of Darwin and the theory of evolution, among other things, came various blows to theology, to Christianity, a pillar of Western culture which provided people with purpose, with meaning, which provided people with a warm sense of belonging. Similarly to Gwyn's Age of Fire, Nietzsche wrote this amazingly powerful parable about the death of God. I've talked about it before, but it's worth revisiting. It's called The Madman. A man walks into a marketplace in the daytime, holding a lit lantern, because of course only he realizes how lost and in the dark we truly are. He frantically looks for God and calls for him with his lantern, and a crowd gathers around him and starts to mock him, asking him in a joking manner, "Where is God? Is he lost? Did he immigrate?" But the madman glares back at them and declares, "God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him." Nietzsche tells us there's no turning back from the death of God, and there's no making amends with his death. You cannot reconcile reason with faith, as many theologians were doing at the time. God is dead, and we have killed him, by taking this Faustian bargain of seeking pure reason, pure rationality. But the true terror of this moment lies in what follows God's death. As the madman later says, "Where are we moving to? Away from all suns? Are we not continually falling? And backwards, sideways, forwards, in all directions? Is there still an up and a down? Are we straying as though through an infinite nothing? Isn't empty space breathing at us? Hasn't it got colder? Isn't night and more night coming again and again? Don't lanterns have to be lit in the morning?" From this point, Nietzsche argues we are left with two choices, two possible outcomes. First, a fall into despair, the upending of all values, of all structure that was previously provided to us by God, leads us into pure nihilism. In this sense, the death of God, the fading of the flame, is the greatest tragedy in all of human history. We will join the crestfallen warrior, who takes no pleasure from this world other than to revel in the misfortune of others, who willingly accepts his sorry state sitting down. He is a nihilist after all, and what reason does he have to get up and fight for some fading world?
"What's wrong? Get a bit of a scare out there? No problem. Have a seat and get comfortable. We'll both be hollow before you know it."
But the other possible outcome is, I believe, represented in the Dark Lord ending, where we neither lie down and fade into nihilism, nor do we impotently try to maintain the social order which is clearly on its way out, which doesn't even really serve us in its present state. We will graduate, we will evolve into what Nietzsche called the Übermensch, the man who does not inherit meaning in values and structure, he makes his own. He accepts the death of God and sees the darkness left by it, but not as some overwhelming nihilistic despair, but as total uninhibited freedom. And in the world of Dark Souls, this is especially the case since humanity originates from the dark, and that is where our true potential resides. Aldea summed it up quite nicely when speaking about Gwyn's linking of the fire.
"Men are props in state of life, and no matter how tender, how exquisite, a lie will remain a lie."
But I do believe it is worth it to think about the linking of the fire ending as well. After all, there was value in the Age of Fire, and many might believe that even if the Age of Dark is inevitable, even if the world as we know it will sooner or later cease to exist, that it was worth preserving. Someone we could say possesses a certain degree of faith. Søren Kierkegaard was a Danish religious philosopher, and although he was a devout Christian, I imagine him and Nietzsche would actually find a lot of respect for each other. Although they live in opposite philosophical spaces, Nietzsche being an atheistic rational and Kierkegaard being a religious romantic, both possess an incredible amount of intellectual bravery. They both possess a philosophical heroism that is extremely captivating. We've sort of established how the Dark Lord ending is the rational approach. The fire is fading, the dark is an inevitability. The cycle of sacrificing yourself to relink the fire and to get rid of the undead curse is cruel, and perpetuating this state of affairs is totally irrational. But a man like Kierkegaard would argue that it must be done despite all those rational reasons. As a matter of fact, he would argue it is precisely because of those reasons that it must be done, that it is through the irrationality of these actions that they acquire meaning. That is exactly what makes them divine. A biblical story that Kierkegaard took great interest in is the story of Job. Now, I won't bore you with the entire story, but it goes a little something like this. Job was a righteous religious man. He was a devout follower of God, and for his righteousness and devotedness, he was awarded abundance. A wife, healthy children, sheep, property, anything a man could want at that time. But one day, the devil doubts Job's devotefulness to God, and he essentially tells God that if he did not shower Job with all these material pleasures, that he would not be God's devout follower. And so God plagues Job with all kinds of maladies, death, plague, disease. Job is plunged into suffering without any sort of explanation. And although Job does not understand why God befalls all these horrible things onto him, Job still remains faithful and devoted to him. And he shows that his devotion is not for any kind of reward or due to any kind of rational understanding of God's actions. It's the purest form of faith. This is the sort of man Kierkegaard intends to be. He tells us that we must take a leap of faith, abandon mere rationality for something greater. And it's precisely because God's actions in the story of Job are irrational that they are divine. Rationality is granted to us from birth, but faith is earned. Soler is in a sense a very Kierkegaardian figure, I think. Soler loves the sun. He is a faithful servant of the age of fire, and even he can surely see that the sun is well past its glory. It does not shine as brightly as it did during the golden age of fire, yet he continues to praise the sun, not because it guarantees him any sort of salvation, but because the belief itself gives his life meaning and purpose. That is what allows him to move forward courageously. That is where he finds the will to help others like us. Could I perhaps say that that is why we love and admire Soler? Perhaps linking the fire is not an ignorant act. Perhaps it is just as courageous as bringing about the age of dark. It is much like Kierkegaard's leap of faith, a conscious and informed embrace of faith, even when confronted with great despair. In a sense, both Nietzsche and Kierkegaard would believe that the worst fate of all is of course to go hollow. From a Nietzschean perspective, to go hollow is to succumb to nihilism, the collapse of all meaning and values without the strength or courage to create new ones. It is the condition of what Nietzsche called the last man, the total opposite of the Übermensch, the man who passively accepts the decline of the Golden Age. Everything around him decays and produces decay. From Kierkegaard's perspective, and since he is much more of a romantic than a rationalist, to go hollow is to lose faith, to lose human passion. It is true that we are the only rational animal on this earth, but it is also true that we are the only romantic animal on this earth. By abandoning that part of ourselves, we deny ourselves altogether. And as Kierkegaard tells us, the greatest hazard of all, losing oneself, can occur very quickly in the world, as if it were nothing at all. To finish off, we can compare the final choice in Dark Souls to Kierkegaard's either-or. For Kierkegaard, what matters most is that you make the choice between the aesthetic life and the ethical life, between rationality and faith. The truth is that you have no guarantee of salvation in either outcome, no guarantee that you will not suffer. The worst outcome is to not choose, to not be an individual. Kierkegaard often thought about what would be on his tombstone after he died. He did not want a name or date. He simply wanted that individual. Because to not choose is to be less than human, to be hollow. So stay safe, friend, and don't you dare go hollow.
He will never be Super Mario 64.